Hello!
Hey, how's it going?
It is going okay.
All right.
I'll give it a good solid okay. We had a lice infestation this weekend.
Oh, gross.
And yeah, it was just gross and yucky. And it was the kids that got it. And it was probably from some theater stuff at school. And that's all. That makes sense and whatever, but still it involved a lot of washing of things, a lot of running to a lice clinic back and forth, and a lot of keeping some very frustrated children occupied while they had itchy heads. So overall, not an awesome weekend, but I have had a lovely opportunity to make as many louse jokes as I possibly could for 48 hours. And so all of that is good.
That checks out. Yes.
Yeah. So how are you doing?
Well, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I'm realizing that Mondays very well may be my best day of the week. And this is when we have been recording, is on Mondays. And my work week is Wednesday through Saturday. And so I finally get through my work week. And then I get to go to church on Sunday and just kind of rest and restore. And then I have the evening to connect with my family. And by the time I wake up Monday morning, I feel like a new human. And I get to do all sorts of fun things, including record with you. But I get to translate with my buddy. I get to do some sermon prep. I get to do all sorts of things that I just love. And so by the time I'm talking to you, I'm almost always just doing great. And so that's how I am.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's a good day when you have space for the things that matter to you.
Absolutely. Yes, that is what Mondays are. That's so awesome. But I am calling because we are about to kick off just next week our Summer in the Psalms series.
I know. I can't believe it has come already again.
Yes, exactly. And yet, it's fascinating. In preparation for this episode, I was listening back to our recap episode, way back, episode 65, and realizing just where we were. We had just gotten back from vacation and we had been together, and it was a fun episode to go revisit. But I'm realizing a lot of life has been lived since last we did our Summer in the Psalms series.
No kidding, huh? To think back a year ago from when we did this, it's just fascinating how different things are in our lives.
Yes. And I think that's definitely going to impact how I read the Psalms this year. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I really hope we can do with this episode is look back at our last go-round with the Summer in the Psalms. What did we learn? What did we take away? And how do we want to approach the Psalms this year as we dive in?
Yeah, that would be great.
So I took a look at that last episode. I don't know if you did something similar, but what were some of the things that you took away from the Summer in the Psalms experience last year?
Absolutely. So I'll be honest, I knew you were going to listen to that episode, and I intentionally didn't, because I'm really curious. Even as I share the things that I remember now, a year later, I'm curious how that stacks up against the things I said then. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think you have a long history of agreeing with yourself, so I think this is going to work out okay.
Hey, when you're as brilliant as me, it is hard to avoid agreeing with yourself.
When's that humility episode coming out?
I don't want to say because I'm too impressed with how well it went. No, wait. Let's see. There are a couple of things that stuck with me. One is how deeply this is so interesting. I think this is partially influenced by our study of Revelation that has been happening concurrently to when we're recording this episode.
Yes.
But there is some profoundly metaphorical language in the Psalms for the presence and activity of God in the world. And I think one of the things I remember is being deeply intrigued by the engagement of God with the world and what the Psalms tells us about that, not as a teaching text, but as a worship text.
Yeah, I don't know that we said it in quite the same way, but that certainly has echoes of what we talked about. And yes, I think the Psalms definitely have a worldview about how God operates within the world and worships God through that worldview. Their mentality, their way of viewing the world, obviously, just like all of us, right, is assumed. And so they don't have to explicitly state it. So I think part of reading the Psalms is spending enough time with them to understand the worldview that they are assuming and then being able to worship God in light of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have other things, but I'm curious, what about you? What were your takeaways from last year, or what has stayed with you about the Psalms?
Well, the one thing that's really stayed with me about the Psalms is exactly what you were just alluding to. This is Yahweh's world. That was something we talked about a lot last year. So that's carried with me. And I think as I approach this year, I run and come back to the Psalms knowing that that's one of the assumptions being made. And I'd like to know, in what way is that true? In what way is this Yahweh's world? So that definitely sticks with me. But talking about where we are in life and what a difference a year makes, it was fascinating to me that at the end of this Summer in the Psalms experience, you were talking about how you are in a time of transition and how rest and sabbatical and the worldview of the Psalms is such an important thing for you to take with you at the beginning of a brand new journey. And that was fascinating to me because you are still working through your journey, but it is by no means at the beginning stages any longer. It is a thing in motion. It doesn't quite have all of the momentum you anticipate it having later on, but it is a thing that you are doing. And I feel very much in flux and in transition right now. I mentioned on a prior episode that I have paused my schooling for the counseling degree and may or may not resume it. And instead, I'm focusing on some formation things. I'm focusing a little bit more on hopefully some rest. But then some opportunities came up to get involved at the church that I'm really excited about and all of these other things. So I feel in this kind of new phase or this beginning of a transition phase. And it's fascinating that I will get to adopt the Psalms while I'm at the starting line, just like you did.
That's interesting. So I'm curious if that sort of resonance with where I was at a year ago results in any particular resonance with any of the things I said about the Psalms or that we said about the Psalms in that moment last year.
You know, I don't think we tied it together that well, honestly. And so I don't think I have an answer to that.
That's fair. Well, and I think even that begs one of the questions that I have as we look forward to the Psalms this year. You know, as I reflect on the Psalms, I am struck by their sort of deeply global scope, meaning, like you were saying, this is Yahweh's world. God is at work in the world at large. But then there's this very deeply personal scope as well. You know, I'm sinking in the mire, those kinds of things. I'm curious, I think, to some degree, what does it mean to live in Yahweh's world? Which is, I think, what you were saying just a few minutes ago as well. Is that right? Am I remembering what you said a few minutes ago correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What is it? How is it true that this is Yahweh's world? What does it mean to live in Yahweh's world? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what I'm curious about, because I am still, to this day, despite all of my attempts to let the Bible form me, I am still a modernist at heart that believes in a natural world and a supernatural world that are deeply divided.
Sure.
And that is not the world the Psalms inhabit. They are, in a lot of ways, the unification of those two worlds.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, what does it mean to live at the intersection of these two things that I keep separate all the time in my head?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think even the way you phrased that curiosity has an intellectual tone to it. And I think as I head into the Psalms this year, maybe there's some intellectual curiosity, but I think to a large extent, there's more of a, maybe you would say emotional, but I think I'd like to phrase it as experiential curiosity. How can I experience being in Yahweh's world? How can I insert myself into this world and feel what it's like to inhabit this world and to see the world through these eyes? One of the things that I did not do well with our Summer in the Psalms series last year was I was in this kind of like, I'm on a break between school programs and I'm really just wanting to rest and rejoice and connect with God in this very peaceful way. And a lot of the Psalms are just not that. And it really frustrated me at times that the Psalms were not in the same emotional space that I was in. And so I want to be far more emotionally flexible, experientially flexible, as I just try to allow myself to inhabit the world of the Psalms.
That makes a ton of sense to me. Even though I phrased it in a fairly intellectual way a few minutes ago, I think you actually hit on something that I resonate quite a bit with. I don't have an intellectual curiosity. On some level, I would call it a narrative curiosity. I just want to be in the story and I want to understand the story. You know, and we did that episode a while back on the grand narrative of Scripture. I know the story, but I really want to be able to sit in the story. Like, you know how this is such a horrible example. This is horrible, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Okay, here we go.
Walt Disney's original vision for Disney World and Disneyland were to be able to go into the stories that he was telling. And to this day, that's the goal, you know, whether it's an old story like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or it's a newer story like all the stuff they have about Star Wars, or it's something a little bit in the middle like they have whatever. But when you walk into Disney World, you feel like you're walking into the story. And that's sort of the vibe that I want. I want to walk into the story.
That's fascinating because that actually sets up a really good analogy for understanding the Psalms. Because if you've been to Disneyland, or I presume Disney World as well, there are different areas of the park where you basically inhabit different stories. And they all have a different theme to them. They all have a different vibe to them. And I think that that is true of the Psalter as well. You might be in a rejoicing psalm one minute and a lament psalm the next minute, and these are going to have very different tones to them. And yet, you know, in the Bible's case, you're inhabiting one big, grand story. But to be honest, it feels at times like you're just in completely separate stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's so true to life, right? You were just saying at the beginning of this episode, Monday's always good because you're doing your favorite things on Mondays.
Yeah.
Different days feel different. And, you know, the fact that overall this is a positive season of my life does not mean it was not wildly frustrating that there were lice that I had to deal with this weekend.
Sure.
That's how life is. And I am very interested. One of the books that I'm wanting to read this year, I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes, is O. Palmer Robertson's The Flow of the Psalms. And this is sort of the big map that helps you identify how those different pieces, different parts of the Psalter or parts of the park all fit together. And I am very interested in that. But on the flip side, I'm interested in not being too rigid about that, because I think real life has lots of seemingly disconnected ups and downs as random circumstances hit you.
Boy, it's so good to put that all in perspective. When you talked about my Monday being very different than some other day of the week, boy, that really made the Psalms make sense. Like some days just, what's the phrase? Hit different. Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, you mentioned the book that you're going to be reading this year. I have already read the book that I'm going to read for this year. I intentionally...
Well, aren't you just an overachiever?
I am. This is just an opportunity for me to try to be better than you. So let me have my
Show
moment.
off.
So I read Open and Unafraid by W. David Taylor, David O. Taylor. And I intentionally read it before starting the Psalms because I wanted to kind of get this overview, this picture of all the different types of things I might encounter in the Psalms. And I think he does a really good job. I mean, just look at some of his titles of his chapters will help you understand he's approaching the different themes of the Psalms. So one chapter is called Honesty, another Community, History, Prayers, Poetry, Sadness, Anger, Joy, Enemies, Justice, and the list goes on. He's clearly just pulling out some of these big rocks and talking a little bit about it and how the Psalter addresses these big things. And so I felt like that was far more of a setting the stage type book than it was like, let me read this as I go. But I think what I might do, though, is read it maybe one time in the middle of our Summer in the Psalms and then read it again at the end. I think that'll be a good way to just kind of drive home some of these bigger themes as I seek to try to inhabit the world of the Psalms.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm going to be reading that one book, but a lot of what I want to do is sort of this reflective reading of the Psalms. I'm actually wanting to read them, first of all, in the Message, because I didn't read all of the Psalms in the Message, and the Message is a great way of reflecting on the Psalms with Peterson and sort of using him as a guide for how to inhabit the Psalms. And then I might pick up this other book. Have you heard of Malcolm Gite? I don't even know if I'm saying his last name right.
No, I have not.
He is a Christian poet, and he has written a lot of poetry, but he has written his way through the Psalms. And I'm curious. I think he wrote a sonnet about each psalm. And I'm curious, again, to see the Psalms through someone else's eyes in order to try to see the world that they are inhabiting as they seek to walk through the Psalms.
Yeah, it's as you were talking about reading the Message, I was starting to get frustrated. I'm like, man, you're stealing my thunder. You're going to read the Psalms the exact same way I'm going to read the Psalms. But it is going to be slightly different. That other author sounds amazing. It sounds like a great way to experience the Psalms. But I'm going to read out of the Message as well for the same reason. I just really want to grasp the poetry, the beauty of the Psalms in a new way. And I think sometimes Peterson has a way of grabbing your attention, particularly because he does not use the typical phraseology that you've come to expect from English translations. So if you're familiar at all with a psalm, his translation will grab you different because he's going to use different language. And so I really appreciate that. So I am looking forward to reading the Psalms in the Message. So what I hope to do more often than not, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this every single day, But I'd love to start the morning by reading that day's reading in the Message. And then I'd like to listen to poor Bishop Hooper's rendition of that psalm. And then I'd like to just kind of chew on that throughout the day. And then I'd like to finish the day by rereading it in the ESV. So, like I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that every single day, but if I could do that, even 3 days a week, I think I'll be happy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also have I also want to draw through the day, and the way I'm going to do it is a little different, but it's that same goal of kind of getting it into me. One of the things that was really impactful for me, actually, when we were talking through whatever psalm you preached on earlier this year.
Psalm 91.
Psalm 91. When we were discussing that, one of the ways I prepped for that was to memorize it. And it was a really great meditative tool to kind of just pick a verse, just to go through a verse a day and just add a verse, add a verse, add a verse. I don't think I'm obviously going to do that straight through, but I do want to pick just a verse each day that I can be sitting with, and that night, as I fall asleep, have that verse in my head. Again, not every day, but 2, 3, 4 times a week, picking a verse that can sit with me through the day and then be the words that I'm thinking as I fall asleep, I think is just a good practice for me.
That does sound like a good practice. On some level, these approaches to reading the Psalms are a little ambitious. It's more than just reading the reading plan, which, again, for our listeners, you can find a copy of the reading plan in the show notes. And then if you follow us on social media, we will post a little 1-week snippets of the reading plan each week so that you can follow along there, or you can follow along in the large reading plan, again, in the show notes. But, it's more than just reading the reading plan. We're both talking about doing some extra things. And that's actually one of my fears with this Summer in the Psalm series this year. Last year, I really needed to have a reading plan coming out of seminary, and I wanted to kind of keep my momentum going, if you will. But this year, I feel like I have some momentum in some other areas, one of which is our Revelation study that we are still doing, and we're going to continue doing all throughout our Summer in the Psalms. We're going to continue reading Revelation and reading books about Revelation, and then release those episodes in the fall. And so I kind of feel like I have a joint reading plan going on, like 2 reading plans at the same time, and I'm kind of nervous about it.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that that's a great point. I think the question of how do you keep those both going is a really important one, and one that a variety of people who are listening to this are going to be coming at the conversation with, hey, I'm already solid and consistent in reading the Bible. How do I do both? And I'm curious, what do you need to do to be able to keep a balance there?
Yeah, I might have to let go of some of my other reading goals. This, to me, is the equivalent of how do you read 5 books at once, right? You and I both get asked that from time to time. And you and I have similar answers. Well, I have a book that I read on my Kindle, and I have a book that I listen to in audio, and I have a book that I read right before bed, and I have a book, there are various places in life where that reading fits. So I think my Revelation study is going to have to be my car listening. I'm going to have to continue to listen to Revelation in the car. I might have to, when I'm done listening to Revelation in the car, I usually turn on whatever book I'm reading on the side, and I might have to reduce the amount of reading on the side in order to listen to poor Bishop Hooper's version of whatever psalm I read that morning, or maybe even listen to Eugene Peterson's rendition of that psalm. So I might just have to give up some of my audiobook time in order to make both reading plans fit. And then I'm going to have to restructure how I go to bed. Like, what do I do right before falling asleep? And I can't be just scrolling through Facebook before I go to sleep, or, checking my fantasy baseball stats or something. I'm going to have to set my phone aside, and I'm going to have to make my ESV version of the Psalms just the last thing I do at night and reread the passage for the day. So I think those changes should be enough, but we'll see.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, and the thing that I love, I always say this with people that I work with is, and if that doesn't work, that's okay. You just take note of why that doesn't work, and then find somebody that you can talk to about how to adjust, right?
Yeah.
It's being willing to make live pivots because things aren't going quite the way you expected.
Yes.
I know for me, I think I'm going to have to capitalize more successfully on the mornings that I don't exercise. There isn't anything in that time slot. It just gets filled with random stuff, which ultimately means time wasted. And I think I'm going to really have to redeem those blocks of time, because I run every other day and then I have open time the other days. And those are going to end up being my revelation time, so that every morning I can start with the Psalms. I think that's how I'm going to do it.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this whole experience. So one of the things that Taylor said in that book, Open and Unafraid, was he actually quoted Basil the Great. And Basil the Great said this about the Psalms, and it really is just exciting to me and illustrates why we want to do this Summer in the Psalm series and why we want to do it year after year. And here is the quote: "The Psalms invite all alike. To novices, it is a beginning. To those who are advancing, an increase. To those who are concluding, a confirmation." And I don't know exactly where to put myself on that, somewhere between novice and increasing. But the Psalms invite all alike. To novices, it's a beginning. To those who are advancing, an increase. To those who are concluding, a confirmation. And if I could be so steeped in the Psalms throughout my life that by the time my life is concluding, the Psalms would be this glorious confirmation, that sounds wonderful to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love, by the time my life is ending, the Psalms to be old friends.
Yeah. Well, I want to invite the audience once again. Our reading plan kicks off next week, right on Memorial Day. So we would love it if you would join with us and, step into the world of the Psalms and let it do its formative work in us. We'd love to do that along with you. As we go, we will talk about the Psalms in one way or another in every episode. We will either dedicate our main topic to the Psalms, or we'll dedicate our thoughts segment to just little bite-sized thoughts of what we got out of the Psalms that week. So we'd love for you to be thinking some of these similar thoughts and sharing those thoughts with us on social media. You can follow us on Facebook or on Instagram. Just look for On the Phone with Josh. We'd love to connect with you.
Absolutely. And if I can throw one other thought in there to our audience, I know, at least for me, when I get going on a new habit, there's inevitably stumbles. I don't read what I'm supposed to read, whatever. It would be so easy to see next week's episode come up and think, oh, I'm supposed to be reading the Psalms. Well, I'm not going to listen then because I didn't read what I was supposed to read or whatever. I want to invite you to listen anyway and let our conversation inspire you to pick up wherever we're all at, rather than going back and trying to get caught up. The growing snowball of I got to get caught up is always such a habit killer.
Yes.
And useless. So just jump on in and listen if you get stuck. And our hope is that our excitement about the Psalms will inspire you to want to keep going and to see why it is you wanted to read the Psalms in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to turn the conversation over to you, Josh from Missouri, and ask, what else are you thinking about?
I have been reading a lot of poetry lately. One of the poems that I was reading this week is by Wendell Berry, who is just an amazing author celebrating the value of nature and small town American experience. And I want to read a little bit from one of his poems this week that's just titled the first line, which is, "I go among trees and sit still." And here's the first two stanzas. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings and I hear its song. What I love about that poem, and the rest of the poem goes on, but what I love about that poem is the phases of silence and stillness that it captures. The fact that there is this initial phase of the mind settling down that takes practice to get to, but then in the stillness beyond that, whenever we can actually get there, frequently it is the deepest things in our hearts, our deepest fears, that then arise. And coming to terms with those things is so important to the process of being able to live with yourself. And I just, his ability to catch all of that in one or two sentences is so powerful to me.
Yeah, no doubt. I think even beyond his ability to capture that, I am struck by the fact that he lives in his life in such a way as to first experience that. And to experience that so deeply, with such familiarity, that he could capture it so well in words. There's a lot that happened in his life before he put pen to paper.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And I certainly find myself to be on the journey of discovering myself in silence and solitude and stillness. And he has become one of the people that offers some guidance in that. And I've just been super grateful for that.
That's great.
But what about you? What else are you thinking about?
Well, so today I went on a little bit of a tear. So our sermon prep team tomorrow is going to be diving into John 16, 1 through 4. And let me read you the NIV version of John 16, 1. And it says, "All this I have told you so that you will not fall away." All right, fair enough. Fall away is the Greek word scandalizo. And we get our English word scandalize from this. And so I was like, what does this really mean? Because does this mean fall away as in like lose your salvation or turn your back on the faith? Or does it mean like, I don't know. I had some thoughts on what I thought it meant. And so I went and like read lexicons on it. I read like some theological articles on this word. And it turns out scandalizo has a very fascinating history to it. Originally, it was like to spring a trap. And eventually it kind of morphed into more of a fall into a trap or be trapped. And then that kind of shifted into like a stumbling block that's in the path. So something you trip over in essence. And then that trip and then that falling kind of took on a moral characteristic to it. And so you have like this falling away or apostasy or falling into sin. But it's not like any one of those definitions fully went away. And so the word gets used in a lot of different ways, or literally to take offense at something, be offended by something. It's often used that way in the New Testament as well. And so what does Jesus mean when he says, hey, I told you these things so that you wouldn't be scandalizoed? Does that mean fall away in a moral sense? Does it mean, hey, I told you these things so that when they happen, it wouldn't be a shock to you. You wouldn't be surprised. The way I'd like to define it is so that you won't be tripped up. And I think that gets at potentially some of the moral implications, right? To trip you up in what way? In such a way that you like turn away and leave the faith? Maybe. But throw you for a loop and just like you're emotionally distraught, or you have this crisis of faith? Maybe that's a way to translate it. Like, I told you these things so that when they happen, it wouldn't cause a crisis of faith. And I think that's really where I landed, is this crisis of faith is what Jesus is getting at here. But I think some of our translations, like, yeah, they might say fall away, but they also might say like fall into sin or abandon your faith. So it's fascinating how one word can really affect the way you see a translation. And it's been all I can think about today.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, and it's just intriguing to me in light of our recent conversation about scholarship in the church, that you would find yourself in this place of really devoting yourself to spend an entire day looking at one word.
But this wasn't like, I don't know how to liken it. It's, you know what it was? This was not like, hey, I'm going to be super scholarly today and I'm going to really understand the definition of this Greek word. This was way more like, man, I can't remember that actor that was in that movie and I've got to figure it out. What was that guy's name? And so you're like Google searching like crazy and you're like, I've got to come up with this. I don't even remember the name of the movie, but it's that one with that one guy. And it's just all consuming. And all day long, you're just trying to come up with the name of that guy. And that's how it felt. It was like all day long, I got to come up with, what does this word really mean?
Yes. Well, and I think that is an important corrective for what scholarship really is. I think we define scholarship the first way as if it's serious men doing serious business. And I think that there is a wonder, delight, and curiosity that drives scholarship that we all can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's awesome. Well, are you ready for something else that is going to inspire wonder, curiosity, and delight?
If you're referring to the witch, Josh, you are way overselling it.
I am. And I am.
All right. Whatever it's going to do, let's just do it.
All right. Well, here it is. Which Josh used to sing the doxology to his kids at bedtime?
Oh, man. This is me, Josh from Oregon. And I'll tell you what, I think about this all the time these days. For whatever reason, I sang a variety of hymns to my kids when they were little at bedtime, but this is the one that they all tend to remember in particular, probably because it was short, and my daughter would ask for it quite a bit. But when we started going to the church that we're at now, a couple of years ago, they had adopted a practice as a church that while they were in this study in John that we've been in for years and will continue to be in for years, they would sing the doxology, because the book of John has a very Trinitarian focus, which is what our church really wanted to emphasize by jumping into the book in the first place. And then the doxology ends the service with a very Trinitarian focus. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And it is so meaningful to me that my kids, well, 2 out of the 3, one goes to a different church, but 2 out of the 3 get to listen to and sing the doxology every single week in a church that we all love. And it feels like it's tying together the bookends of my kids' childhood. And so
that's really cool.
It is. It is. I don't know if they find it as meaningful as I do. I actually would love to ask them, but yeah. So we used to sing the doxology, and it's a very sweet memory for me now.
That's awesome. You're so much more spiritual than me. I always sang Edelweiss to my kids.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I did not know that you did that.
Yeah. I mostly to my daughter. I told my son stories, and I sang Edelweiss to my daughter.
Huh.
Because it has the amount of lyrics that I can remember in a song.
Well, so does the doxology.
Yeah, but I'm not spiritual. So it didn't occur to me to sing a Christian song.
That's awesome.
Well, we on for next week?
Oh, I can't wait. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, I'll talk to you then.
All right. You're back.
All right, bye.